I started studying animals when I was a teenager, and I always knew that I wanted to be a conservationist because I thought animals were far more interesting than people. But I've done a complete turnaround. This is a playground in a place in Nairobi. This is where children play. The foreground is just dirt and stones. The background is a wall where people express themselves, and you can see it's quite violent expression. This particular mural was painted just after the post-election violence. Now, these are the children, and this is the life that these children grow up in. There isn't a single aspect of natural environment in there. There isn't a blade of grass, there isn't a bush. There's nothing growing, nothing green. Hundreds of thousands of children in Kenya grow up in this kind of environment, and millions of people across Africa grow up in the slums. This is Mathare Valley, one of the oldest slums in Africa. So what's happening is we're raising a generation, and let me say generations, of children who are the future leaders of this country, who don't know anything about nature, who are completely disconnected from nature. They don't have anything natural in the environment in which they're growing up in. And yet, out in the rural areas where 75% of Kenya's population live, they're still very dependent on the natural environment. Wood fuel, for example, is the basic source of energy for producing food. And I'm sure you all know that something like 80% of the energy requirements in the city of Nairobi comes from fuelwood, and it's coming from the same environments that our rural communities live in. What we're doing is harvesting the trees, killing them, in order to supply fuelwoods to the cities. And what's happening is we're losing our forests, it's causing rivers to dry up. That's not just water that we're losing, we're also losing our source of energy. That's the future of Kenya, that's our industrial development going down the drain. And yet, in these same rural environments, we have communities who still live very closely with nature. This is a family living in the Tugan Hills, where they plant trees together with their crops, and they live a very natural environment, almost in harmony with nature. And I realized that really what we need to do is to find a way of reconnecting those children in the urban and really the slum areas of Nairobi and other cities of Africa with children growing up in these really wonderful, diverse, natural environments across the continent. A friend of mine, Nixon Parmisa, who's actually here in the audience, challenged me earlier this year, and he said, you know, in his community among the Maasai, the oldest generation are now over 90 years old. Many of them are dying, and with them we're losing all their stories, all their history, all their wisdom, because many of these people are not literate, they've never recorded their stories, and much of what they know is very valuable information for us to enable us to actually live in harmony with the environment. And I realized this really does address the problem that I was facing. How do we reconnect children who are living in the cities? Many children who come from rural areas actually live in the cities now. How do we reconnect them with nature? How do we get them excited about the natural environment, the things that I really am passionate about? And even if we can get that information from these elders, as Nixon had suggested, we can record all this information. How do we reach these children? There are hundreds and thousands, millions of children across Africa. Well, what I decided to do was to take advantage of the fact that 90% of Africans still use the radio as their primary source of information. So what can we do to get those stories onto the radio? Well, we can record them. So I've gone around the country to some of the most spectacular parts of this country and recorded stories from elders. Now, this man sitting on the left, his name is Moses, he's 37 years old, and he's talking to his father, his name is Lekina. Lekina is 93 years old. This conversation between these two men, which we recorded, was just amazing, because Lekina was talking about his father, whose name was Yatuni. And his father was a famous man, famous, let me say, infamous in that community, because he was a glutton. He was so selfish and so gluttonous that he became very well known throughout his community. And the reason why he was gluttonous was because he lived through a period of extreme famine at the time. And so just listening to this young man talking to his father about his grandfather was just an amazing reconnection of generations and knowledge about the past. Yet Lekina starts his story by saying, "My father was famous. He wasn't like any other person. He was more like an animal." And he explains how his father actually lived with wild animals in order to survive. I've also recorded stories from people who have gathered information from other generations. Esther is a woman who knows everything that you need to know about plants for treating diseases. She learned this from her mother and her grandfather, so recording this information is really valuable for anybody who wants to know about traditional medicine. And then I've recorded stories of people that are just fantastic stories. In this case, an elderly man from Samburu. He's over 90 years old, and he was telling me a story about a giant snake. He told me there's this giant snake, it lives in the hills of Laikipia, and it swallows a huge glowing stone. And at night it comes out and it regurgitates this glowing stone, and the stone attracts all these curious animals that come close to see what it is. And when they get close, the snake snaps them up and eats them. And this is how the snake hunts. And the old man said, so what we do is we need to go and find this snake and find the stone, because this stone is incredibly valuable. So later on, I was talking to the young man, and he said to me that this evening he was going to go out and look for the stone. And I said, "You don't really believe this story, do you?" And he turned to me and he said, "Are you saying my grandfather's a liar?" So these stories are really important. I realized quickly that gathering these stories for the project that I had just started, I gave myself 3 months. I needed help. So I turned to young people like Sammy here, who helped me to record some of the stories. We're using a little audio recorder. And what I found is that getting young people to record the stories from the elders in their community, including their own parents and grandparents, was a really incredibly powerful way of actually making these lessons really set in. But what's even more interesting was I thought we were lucky as younger people to be hearing these stories and capturing these stories. Actually, the honor turns around the other way. Just look at the expressions of these men listening to the stories that we've recorded of theirs. For them, it was such a pleasure and such an honor that we were actually interested in recording their stories. These stories are all available on a website called PRX. That's a public radio exchange. So the idea is that anybody can go onto the public radio exchange, look up Africa's Wildest Stories. You can download or stream those stories and listen to them. And you can also contribute the stories to the project through Wildlife Direct, and the website is below. What came about as a result of this project, which was launched earlier this year at the Story Moja Hay Festival in partnership with Story Moja and the National Museums of Kenya, was that people said, well, these stories are fantastic. We love listening to them, but where are the pictures? We want to see these people. We want to see what this environment is like. And so we've started recording the stories. Now, most of the stories I've recorded are of older people telling their stories, because I thought, they're the ones with all the knowledge, right? They're the ones with all the wisdom. And then I had 2 young men came and stayed the night with me. One of them was Richard and his friend Monaco. Monaco is on the right. Monaco had forgotten his toothbrush. And Richard said, well, don't worry, I'll make you one. And off they went into the forest to find sticks. There's a certain tree that Richard knows that you can just take a branch and you can break it and you can make a toothstick or muswaki. And we recorded this story, and then they brushed their teeth. And I realized that the wisdom, we always think of the older generation as being the source of the wisdom, but actually the younger generation has just as many interesting stories. In fact, everybody has a story to tell. So what started off as a project where I aimed to get these stories out through the radio, I realized that actually we need to find a way of gathering stories, gathering thousands and thousands of stories. I want this to be the world's largest archive of African stories about nature and wildlife. And what better way to do this but through telephones? So what we've discovered is that smartphones, you can actually download an app on the smartphone. It's called Taper Talk, and you can convert any telephone into a recording device. So it doesn't take a huge amount of technology. Anybody here could actually participate in this project. Take your phone, download the app, go and record the stories from the elders. One of the saddest moments that I had when I was telling people about my project was a lady in a class of mine who said, I wish I'd known about this. My grandmother just died 2 weeks ago. So she missed an opportunity to actually record her grandmother's stories. Now that the project is going, I'm really encouraging everyone to participate and join me in this to make this the largest archive of African stories coming from the continent and available not just to Kenyans, but across the continent and internationally to the whole diaspora. The reason why I do this is because I care about animals, I care about wildlife, and I care about Africa's just stupendous natural assets and our heritage and, for example, our elephants. This man's name is Mishak. He started working at the elephant orphanage when he was 15 years old. When I recorded his story, it really struck me. That was about the time when I got interested in wildlife. Mishak fell in love with elephants, and he spends every single day with elephants. He wakes up, he feeds them, he takes them on walks at night, he gives them their milk, and he goes to sleep with them. And he told me that he would never do another job. I want everybody in Kenya and across Africa to fall in love with wildlife the way that Meshach fell in love with wildlife. By listening to a story, I think that'll be possible. Thank you.